Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is Kathy Bradley. I'm the Dean of the Colorado School of Public Health on the Anschutz campus. I'm also the Deputy Director of the University of Colorado Cancer Center, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's session, Science Under Siege, a Crisis of Trust and Credibility. I want to start off by reading our land acknowledgement statement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. And while the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you once again, and welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all of our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those being responsible asked to leave the room. And also, please silence your phones. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand, and if you have a question, a producer will give you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly, then raise your hand when you have completed a card, and a producer will collect it and hand it to me. And now I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and remind our audience that full speaker bios can be found online at the CWA website. So we'll start with you, Mike.
Okay, well, thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here in one of our closing sessions here at CWA. This is my first CWA, and I've really enjoyed it. Some really stimulating, remarkable conversations. Hopefully we can keep you guys engaged for the remainder of our time here. So I'm Michael Mann. I am Presidential Distinguished Professor is my official title at the University of Pennsylvania. I have joint appointments in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences and in the Annenberg School for Communication, where I direct a center, the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. My interests include the science of climate and climate change, but also science communication and sort of the interface between science and policy and our public discourse. It's sort of perhaps gratuitous of me to say that the title of this session, Science Under Siege, is actually the title of my most recent book. And I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. But the book was co-authored with my friend and colleague Peter Hotez. Some of you may know him. He's a leading public health scientist and develops vaccines. And it came about because Peter, shortly after the pandemic happened. Peter, as an expert on vaccines, was appearing on television, various cable news networks, trying to get the message out, and he was being attacked. There were efforts to discredit him, to discredit his science, to silence him, to intimidate him. And it was sort of PTSD for me as a climate scientist, because we had been through that decades ago when it became clear that our findings, including the hockey stick curve that I published back in the late 1990s, which became sort of an iconic symbol in the climate change debate, when our science represented a threat to powerful vested interests, the fossil fuel industry in this case, they supported various organizations, front groups, paid advocates to attack the science, to undermine public faith in the science of climate change. And I was seeing the same tactics, some of the same individuals and groups attacking Peter and Tony Fauci and public health scientists. So I reached out to Peter, tried to provide some of the lessons that I felt we had learned in the climate space over several decades and how to deal with this bad faith assault. In the end, it led to this book. We realized we had a book to write, and I know I don't have much time left here, so I'll just say we identify 5 basic forces, and as I'm a sucker for alliteration, they all begin with P. They are plutocrats, the Koch brothers, the Rupert Murdoch and his media empire, Elon Musk, the tech bros. They are petrostates, like Russia, Saudi Arabia, the United States currently under this current administration, Brazil under Bolsonaro, authoritarian petrostates that have seen it being in their interest to undermine science that conflicts with their ideology, whether it be climate change or, as it turns out, the science of vaccination. And then there's the pros, the propagandists, and indeed the press. And I'm not just talking about the conservative media, the Fox News, the Murdoch media empire, but even our mainstream media outlets, legacy media outlets that have engaged all too often in what we describe as performative neutrality. This idea that we need a science denier up there on the same stage as a scientific expert and providing both sides. Well, truth isn't in between truth and falsity. And so this is obviously a problem as well. And and we'll get into this conversation. So what can we do about this? How can we push back against these very powerful forces? And I believe that there's some signs right now that maybe we're starting to see that our voice really does matter, that our vote really does matter, that we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here in this panel, in this conference. I'm Ernesto Araújo. I'm a career diplomat. I have a degree in literature and linguistics. And today I'm on a leave from the diplomatic career, and I have some courses and podcasts about geopolitics and other issues. I've been the foreign minister of Brazil during the first 2 years and 3 months of President Bolsonaro administration, and I'm very honored. I just learned that our administration is considered one of the enemies of science.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, I have a different perspective, of course. I'm convinced that we were, and we still are, although out of government, fighting for freedom, human dignity, and democracy in the world. And I think that the Galileos are actually the church, and the church is the Galileos now. Of course, I'm considered a climate skeptic, and I would like to go to also a linguist by training, go to the etymology of skeptical, skepsis. It comes from Greek skeptomai, which means to look at or to look for, basically to look at, to examine, to investigate. Right? So which has to do with, has the relation with the Latin verb specio, which give us, is the same origin, give us words like spectacular, but also special, perspective, speculation. So it also reminds us of the individual, the need for freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, and all that. So just a little bit of the Greeks. Thales of Miletus in the 6th century said there is only one element, that everything is made of water. Right? 1 century later, Empedocles said there are 4 elements: water, fire, earth, and air. Right? And the game is going on ever since, right? Fortunately, there was no IPCC or any China-dominated scientific panel back then to tell people, no, there's only one element, science is settled, right? No, things have gone on. Anyway, a couple of more elements. Science under siege, totally agree. I totally agree science is under siege. Right? I only think that those under siege are the skepticals. Right? I think those are the bearers of the banner of real science. Who is politicizing science? Those who hold power, bureaucratic international elites. Yes, there are some billionaires that are more to the skeptical side, but I know also many billionaires that are on the, let's say, the climate change side, like Bill Gates, for example, and others. So I think power is what explains all this debate. And just to end, my mentor, my master in everything that I'm doing now, late Brazilian philosopher Olavo de Carvalho, who had a large experience. He was a former communist, turned, of course, anti-communist, and he had a large experience of Marxist communist strategies. And one way he defined those strategies was like this. It doesn't work very well in English, but I'll try to translate. So Marxists advise their own to do this. Call your enemies what you are. No? So you're a fascist, call them the fascist. And accuse them of doing what you do. So, right? You're politicizing science, and so accuse the other side of politicizing science. Okay? So we have to be, I think, aware of that, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to have this discussion here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming to this, I think, final event today. I'm Laura Linenfeld, and every day I get up and I'm thrilled that I get to run the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. Really pleased. And I believe there's a siege on science, and I think science needs support. And what we do at the center, this was an idea of Alan Alda's, the famous actor. He did Scientific American Frontiers for 11 years. How many of you followed this show, or you know his podcast, Clear and Vivid? It's wonderful. He loves science, and he came around with this idea that improvisational theater might help scientists learn how to connect. At Stony Brook University, where my center is housed, I'm also a social scientist. I study science communication, and I've done a lot of work looking at how scientists themselves perceive engagement and what would make it more likely for them to be engaged, because it can be very frightening in a world where you may be attacked on camera or elsewhere. So I'm grateful every day I get to get up, and we've trained over 35,000 scientists using improvisational theater and social science-based strategy to link arms together and communicate the value and importance of their work.
I'm Nalini Nadkarni. I'm an ecologist in the biology department at the University of Utah, and also a National Geographic explorer at large. I'm really deeply interested in the public engagement of science, especially for public groups that do not or cannot get access to science and nature through traditional science educational venues because of financial or cultural or legal barriers. So I feel like our panel is addressing one of the most important subjects for humans and our planet. But I think that even the framing and the language of its title, Science Under Siege and Science Under Attack, frames this approach as a conflict and sets us up with a mentality of confrontation and even retaliation, rather than signaling possibilities for collaboration and conciliation among groups that might have seemingly different values and cultures than science. And I think this approach really draws from the idea that the public is ignorant or uninterested or antagonistic to science. But in fact, in many cases, the opposite is true. The Pew Research Center recently published a paper that showed that 3/4 of Americans place scientists in the most trusted groups in society, and 3/4 of our public is actually interested in science. And so you have to think about it, like I as an academic scientist for 40 darn years, that I think that disconnection, the connection between siege against science and the fact that publics really approve of science, is due to 3 elements. First of all, I think overall it's about how science is practiced, how scientists are trained, and how scientists remove their own humanness when they talk to the general public. So the 3 elements that contribute to that are, first of all, we know that science is a powerful way of knowing, but we as scientists sometimes act like it's the only valid way of knowing because of our training teaches us to be precise and confident and right. And that can make us sideline other perspectives like aesthetic or indigenous or spiritual or intuitive perspectives. And that makes us blind, I think, to the commonalities that exist among many different ways of knowing. Secondly, we are in an academic reward system where academic papers and academic proposals and grants are the currencies of success. So that training for science communication, like Laura, and communicating with broader audiences is rarely incentivized or rewarded. And third, in striving for objectivity, scientists often strip away their own personness, their stories, their motivations, and their own personal interests. And so if people cannot see us as scientists as fellow humans who are curious, who are passionate, who are uncertain, and who are involved with the same activities that they are less likely to trust us, which maintains this adversarial us versus them relationship. So I have been trying to respond to this by an approach I call tapestry thinking, of weaving scientific knowledge with the values and the lived experiences of non-science communities. And this has shifted me away from a conflict-driven mentality to one of diplomacy or ambassadorship, to find common ground and move towards conciliation and collaboration. And I'll give you just a few examples about tapestry thinking and how it's worked for me. First, I've tried to partner with unexpected allies. For instance, I've worked with the Mattel Corporation, which makes Barbie, who is an icon of materialism and consumerism, to create a treetop Barbie and a set of explorer Barbies to provide models for little girls to aspire to become women in field biology. Secondly, I've developed collaborations with the fashion world, another world that is synonymous with consumerism and materialism, to embed botanical accuracy and conservation messages into clothing like this amazing jacket I'm wearing right now that comes with hang tags with information about the biology and conservation of the species that's depicted on that garment, to make fashion a force for nature. And in this process, what I've learned is that there is a large part of the fashion industry that is moving towards what they call slow fashion, that is to use regenerative fabrics as well as non-toxic inks. Second, I try to use humility by drawing upon authorities of other groups. This, I think, was shaped by my own mixed religious background of a Hindu father and an Orthodox Jewish mother, but I've drawn upon the writings of holy scriptures of all world religions, the Bible, the Quran, the Talmud, to link ecological care with spiritual and religious values, and delivering sermons from pulpits and making pamphlets about the trees that grow in churchyards that embody the connection between trees and spirituality. And I have learned about and join the efforts of the many existing earth stewardship programs that already exist within religious traditions. Third and finally, I've tried to align my scientific values with the values of institutions that seem completely antithetical to our values. For 20 years, I've been working with the system of mass incarceration to bring science, education, and participatory ecological restoration projects to inmates in state prisons and juvenile detention centers, the extreme of nature and education deficit institutions. To get access to these carceral institutions, we had to frame these activities along the values of the prison wardens, drawing upon data that shows that exposure to education and to nature actually reduces recidivism, promotes and enhances the probability of post-release employment, and decreases violent infractions, which are their values as well as ours. So all of this tapestry thinking has led me to understand that we can think about other groups that are normally considered not part of us as part of us, if we approach them with intellectual humility and with ways to align our values with theirs. And I would love to think more about and to talk about with this group and anybody else about how this tapestry thinking approach can complement other worthy efforts that draw upon approaches that are trying to counter the siege against science.
Thank you for those introductions. It's such an honor to be a moderator of a very distinguished panel, and I appreciate the diversity of perspectives you all brought and that you bring. So this is going to be a very stimulating conversation. I ask I know you all have so much to say, but as we go through, let's try and share the floor and give different perspectives that this audience really wants to learn. So I want to pick up on one of the points that was made. Scientists are human. They also represent organizations. So when we think about trust, is there an intersection between the human scientists and the organization they represent? And how does that interplay into this idea that there is a siege mentality or more mistrust that might be there, that intersection?
I love this question. There's actually a lot of great data on this, that depending on where science is conducted, according to political party, I think this is Pew Research, there's more or less trust on one side or the other. So this is not a complete picture to say there's distrust in science. There's really a lot of variation. I will say in the work that we do, and Nalini, I'm sitting here nodding my head in agreement, we're so much on the same page about helping inject an ability to make connections with people who are not like you, who haven't been trained like you. It's really easy to forget what it feels like to not know what you know. And when you do that, you only communicate about it in one way. So a lot of the work that we do at the center is to help scientists build trust with people who may think differently. The premise of improv, anybody here done improv? What's the first rule of improv? What do you have to say? Yes, and. Doesn't mean you agree with someone else's worldview, but you accept their dignity and humanity and you build on it, and that fosters connection and trust. So I think we do a lot of similar work.
Comment.
Yeah, so I think this is fertile ground here for discussion, because it's important for people to understand how science is done. Science is done by individuals. Individual scientists are people, they're human beings, and they have all the flaws that are intrinsic to being a human being. That's why we have scientific assessments. That's why we have institutions like the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which I'm very proud to be part of, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What these assessments do is they look at the consensus across the scientific literature. They look for conclusions that have been reaffirmed by multiple studies using different approaches, different groups around the world. What is it, the consensus? What is it that scientists agree upon? And in the case of climate change, these national assessments, the assessments of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, all the national academies of all the major industrial nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in every case, the reports that have come out from these assessments affirm that the planet is warming, the climate is changing, human beings are the cause. We are already seeing devastating consequences. I don't have to convince people who live here in Colorado. You've just been through a record warm March. The 2013 floods in Boulder were an example of climate disasters, weather disasters that we can now say are linked to climate change in the sense that they were astronomically unlikely to have happened in the absence of human-caused warming. So to take those assessments, to take the consensus of the world's scientists and dismiss it as a Marxist hoax, for example, based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't hold up to the slightest bit of independent scrutiny, that's not skepticism, folks. That's contrarianism, it's denial. The great Carl Sagan spoke eloquently of the self-correcting machinery of science, and it's driven by skepticism, but honest skepticism, not politically or ideologically motivated rejection of consensus science. Thank you.
I'll just say something very brief, which is about the word trust, which I think is so important in all of this. And I'll just parenthetically, as tree scientists, tell you that the word trust and comes from the word troth, which is also derived from the word deru, which means tree. And so I'd like to just put a pitch out there for truth and trees. But I think that has another, I'm mentioning that because I think where we get information really matters. And I think Laura knows this also, as she has trained so many scientists to know, that we as scientists are put in a certain place in society, and many people trust us. As I said, 3/4 from that Pew Center study do trust scientists, but many people get their information from sources that they trust. And with my work in churches and with congregations, I realize the power of the minister, the power of the rabbi, the power of the priest, the power of those individuals who have been anointed and designated as the voices of authority, along with the scriptures that come out of that, are really incredible. And in some ways, I was sort of envious with how a minister would be able to say something that his congregants or her congregants would have more weight than I as a scientist would. And so I think we have to think about finding the messenger whom different public groups trust, and to place the messages that come from scientists that are validated by exactly what Michael was talking about, this very rigorous, not just peer-reviewed single papers, but the rigor that the IPCC or the National Academy would put together, but to somehow figure out how we can place those messages to be accepted by those people in authority in public groups that will prefer to listen and take their information from the messengers whom they logically trust.
Well, I know many climate skeptics in the scientific community. I want to quote from one of them, Dr. John Clauser, winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics of 2022, if I'm not mistaken. Who, by the way, he signed, was the first signer of a declaration saying there is no climate crisis or anything like that. But he's on record saying climate change is a myth, climate change is a pseudoscience. That's from a Nobel Prize winner scientist. I don't think that you can accuse someone like that of dishonesty. He may have his reasons to think that climate change is a pseudoscience, right? Why did someone like that go as far as to say that, right? Because there's something that goes beyond just a scientific normal disagreement, something that goes towards political questions, right? And again, I come back to the, unfortunately I have to come back to that, to the Marxist strategy of accusing the others of what you are. So where's the intellectual dishonesty? It's very easy to call, to dismiss different points of view, calling, okay, no, I'm here to discuss everything, I'm totally open, scientific, but no, this is not honest. Right? Of course, this is not a scientific game, this is a political game. Right? The French historian of science, Pierre Duhem, he says, let me see, I have the exact quote, or almost. He says basically that, well, regarding physics, it was in the beginning of the 20th century. He was a great scientist, by the way, not only a great historian of science. And he said that basically physics always depends on metaphysics. Right? It depends on the view, your view of reality. I would say even more. Now, today, physics depends on politics, right? Individuals, we're saying that science is done by individuals. Individuals are political animals, according to Aristotle, right? So there is power involved. I would argue in this line, okay? In the 90s, the world was ready for an era of abundance, freedom, democracy, right? And certain currents of power in the world didn't want to lose their power to the people, to democracy, didn't want humanity to live in freedom and abundance. There was a crisis, but not of the climate, a crisis of statism, of state-controlled power, and how to change that world that was heading towards more freedom. So, let's say that markets are destroying the planet. Let's say that decisions must be taken by a group of unelected scientists appointed by groups of elected or non-elected politicians wanting to hold power. And then, especially after the year 2000, you have the question of China, which joins that coalition, that anti-freedom coalition. They were always there, but it became a big player in that room. And people realized that China can be a great ally. So what that sort of coordination of powers, I'll say conspiracy. No. Powerful people coordinate among themselves. That's a reality. You can call it conspiracy or not, but that's a reality. And they realize that, climate change, the climate crisis scare can be used to weaken Western, democratic West, and to reinforce socialist, Marxist China. And that's the big operation that is basically underway, especially on the basis of the Paris Agreement of 2015, whereby China is allowed to keep growing its CO2 emissions up to the year 2030, and only in 2030 they have to peak, whereas democratic Western countries have to already had to peak their CO2 production. The Europeans are committing economic suicide because of a totally premature and absurd energy transition. So let's go to another science. Sorry, I'm talking too much, but just to suggest that another science, juridical science. In law, you always ask, cui bono, all that. People, democracy, freedom, no. All the beneficiaries by the way, COVID is the same thing, of climate policies are totalitarian regimes and people associated to them in the West.
So that might be a good place. Michael, did you want to make one final comment?
I did. There's a lot of mud on the walls here, and I'm going to try to scrape some of it off here. Carl Sagan spoke very eloquently about the various fallacies that we fall victim to, and one of the fallacies is cherry picking. Hey, there's one scientist, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who has no expertise whatsoever in climate science, who has contrarian views about regulation, who has expressed the view that climate change is a hoax, like the gentleman next to me. On the other hand, there are many dozens of Nobel Prize winners across all fields of science who have signed on to those consensus statements that I was mentioning, that affirm what the National Academy of Sciences has concluded. So cherry picking, and also the idea, like tactics, this idea that projection, accusing your opponent of the thing that you are guilty of, that's a Marxist approach. That's the politics of Karl Rove. That's the politics of Roy Cohn. That's the politics of the current administration. And so that itself was an act of projection. I just want to point that out. Thank you, and let me, in case you think that there isn't, one more point, thank you. In case you think that there isn't a siege on science, I want to remind people here who live in Boulder of what's going on with the great National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, where I visited NCAR, spent 2 weeks back in 1994 as a graduate student, working, meeting, getting to know the leading climate scientists in the world because of this institution that provided us with the capacity to model the climate and predict the sorts of disasters that are now playing out. And I just want to read this. This was from a recent article, I think, of The Guardian. National Center for Atmospheric Research has been targeted for months by the Trump administration. In a social media post in December, Russell Vought, the White House budget director and chief architect of Project 2025, called the Colorado Center one of the largest sources of climate alarmism in the country. So we are literally dismantling our infrastructure for doing science, not because of legitimate skepticism about the science, but because of the perceived policy implications of that science by people who find those implications challenging to their beliefs, challenging to their economic interests.
Very robust discussion. I'd like to turn to the panelists at the end of the table to think about the discussion we just had. And I want to build off a bit from one of our audience questions. How do you know now what's disinformation? Okay. And that you take that and what is being used to manipulate public opinion, how do you know to recognize it? And then what do you do?
I can say a few words. I don't want to dominate the discussion. I just came from the Cambridge Disinformation Summit in Cambridge, England, which, interestingly, Cambridge was also the source of Cambridge Analytica, which was one of the greatest sources of the spread of disinformation on social media today. It was an effort to weaponize disinformation. What do we mean by disinformation? We distinguish it from misinformation because there's motive, there's intent. Misinformation can be innocent. Every day, we communicate misinformation to each other. We're not 100% accurate sort of evaluators of our factual world, right? So we all occasionally fall victim to misunderstanding. We express misinformation, but hopefully we do so honestly. It is when we do so dishonestly that we spread misinformation, not to inform the discussion, but to disinform the discussion, to help motivate policies or an agenda that, again, advances our financial or political interests. And that is arguably, and Peter, in our book, we talk about three great challenges we face: the climate crisis, the threat of ever more deadly pandemics, but the greatest crisis of all is anti-science disinformation, because it renders it impossible to address any of the great challenges that we face.
Oh, go ahead. That's okay. Yeah, I think, Michael, that absolutely, I mean, I never really thought about the difference between misinformation and disinformation, but that is so troubling. And I think this goes back to, I think, something that Laura and I both share. I don't want to speak for you, but this idea of academia doing a better job of making connections, of establishing trust at the scientist-to-person level is what's so fundamental, because the precept behind scientific thinking is critical thinking. It's looking at a tree, looking at a river, looking at a set of people, and understanding what's really going on here. And scientists use these tools of experimentation and observation, peer review, and so forth, to pull out the threads of what they see as truthful. And I think that sense of truth, and we just talked about this, really has to be conveyed by the right people, and the public has to trust the scientists to express it and look to the scientist or the indigenous leader or the artist or the person who has intuition and say, I feel that that is true. And so I think the real key is a much more long-term one than a 4-year voting cycle. It's about training our young people to love science, to love the critical thinking that comes from at least one of the sources of critical thinking, which is science, so that they can become better at discerning the difference between information, misinformation, and guard against disinformation.
I want to build on this, thinking about some of the distrust that's been created around universities, which are so important to our and other societies. And when you step back, and I think you and I think very similar, you talk about tapestry, I think about this is really a system level problem. So how do you detect or know mis and disinformation? That's one thing. There's an intent on one. Another misinformation might just be conveyed, can be just as dangerous. What do we do to address this? And I really think our work has so much in common. I'm really appreciating being on this panel with you. And one of the things we were chatting before we started is the need for a sense of community across the scientific community, that this is important work to do, and that it takes some resilience. Mm-hmm. It takes some connection. I mean, you think about post-COVID, how much duress healthcare workers were and still are under. Scientists are feeling something similar. It's a different configuration, but it's very hard to put yourself out there when you're afraid you're going to be disliked, distrusted, and you have to defend yourself. That is certainly not the reason most people sign up to study science. And now you're having to be in a defensive position. So I think a lot of the work that you and I both do is about preparing this community of growing scientists. The earlier we can do this, the better. I'd love to see science communication, which means learning how to communicate, to build trust and engage, built into the educational experience of what it even means to be a scientist, not the last step of the scientific process.
And can I say one more thing? Sorry. Which is, scientists are trained to draw upon data. The more data, the better. And they're taught that single examples are not valid, because single examples, that is storytelling, can be used to really convey any message. I could look at a tobacco company can look at an 80-year-old woman who's been smoking for 40 years and say, Granny looks pretty good. She doesn't have cancer, so it's clearly okay to smoke for 40 years. Well, scientific data would show exactly the opposite, obviously, because there's tons of data that shows that smoking for 40 years doesn't work. And so scientists have shied away from storytelling as a means to convey their information. But what I see very often now in scientific communication trainings and circles is that scientists are understanding the power that storytelling has. The fact that scientists stick in the minds of the public. Very, very reasonably, we evolved with storytelling to communicate important things to our fellows. And so I think that scientists are beginning to use techniques drawn from storytelling to make scientific stories or scientific data stick better. And I think we could do better at using some of the techniques of marketing and advertising to propone what scientists know as truth. And so I don't know exactly where that will go, but I think that there is hope in terms of scientists becoming better communicators, drawing upon these different approaches and tools that until quite recently were sort of off limits in terms of science.
So I want to build off of that point. During COVID, it was interesting how scientists was unfolding in front of us in real time. And we got to see how science was informing political decisions, but we also got to see how scientists think. And as scientists, we're very comfortable with uncertainty. And we will say things like, well, there's an effect with this particular drug. And then the next day say, but it actually works better in women. No, it's women over 55. And as scientists, we're all okay with that. We're getting better data. We're getting more information. But if you're somebody trying to digest that in real time, you can see how mistrust might happen. Well, wait a minute, do they know what they're talking about? Because they just said it was women, then they said it was women over 55, and then they said, what do we believe? So what did we learn from COVID? As science unfolded in real time, political decisions were made, and I think we might have demonstrated we aren't the world's best communicators, and for a typical audience to digest.
Yeah, well, let me start just because I did just write a book with a vaccine specialist who developed vaccines, low-cost vaccines for third world countries to deal with COVID more cheaply. I think, Kathy, what you said is exactly right. It really, what's remarkable about COVID-19, it was sort of in some ways so similar to the evolution of our climate discourse, but accelerated by a factor of 100 at least. And everything, the sorts of things that have happened over decades, the refinement of our understanding, the refinement of our models, things that have happened over decades in the climate arena, literally were happening in months with COVID-19, and we were able to see that self-correcting machinery. I like to think that was an ideal opportunity to actually see how science works. Remember when we were all using hand sanitizers at the very beginning because the belief was that COVID-19 was being spread by physical contact, and as additional data came in and experiments were done, we realized that the virus was being aerosolized and it was actually spread in the air, and then we started to wear masks because the science informed our approach. Donald Trump, one of the most heroic things he did was to invest in the high, Project Warp Speed, the fastest that we have ever developed a vaccine to deal with something of this. It was a remarkable success of science, and sadly he was unable to take credit for it because his party and their base decided that they didn't accept what public health scientists were saying. They didn't believe that vaccines were, they believed that vaccines were actually causing much of the illness. And so to me it's so tragic because Donald Trump actually could have been a hero here had he not sort of given into his base. But we did get to see the evolution of science, and scientists did change their views and our understanding evolved, but it was that self-correcting machinery that Sagan so eloquently described. We got to see it play out in real time. It was one of the great successes of science in the modern era.
Yeah. So regarding COVID science, I think that's very interesting. I'll give you a concrete example of how COVID science was done. A couple of months into the pandemics, some doctors, so scientists, started to try the use of hydroxychloroquine to reduce the danger of death and basically to cure. Or at least to make people go more safely through the COVID. And this was contrary to the political narrative that had already taken shape. That
it doesn't work.
Let's see how it doesn't work and how honesty is involved. So the political scheme wanted to say, oh, there's no medication for COVID. Only we have to wait for vaccines, and before that, we need total social control. So why do you think that, I'll explain, why people think that hydroxychloroquine didn't work. A study was done in the city of Manaus in Brazil by a doctor who, by the way, is politically affiliated to the left-wing party, the Workers' Party. And he took a bunch of people and he gave an enormously absurd high dose of hydroxychloroquine to those people. Of course, most of those people died. And he published that study in Lancet. Lancet has lately, too late, withdrawn that study, but that study was used by WHO and other people that replicate that sort of dishonesty around the world to say, no, there's no cure for hydroxychloroquine. How many people died that should not have died if this criminal study was not published in Lancet? How many people, no, sorry. How many people died because later it was, at least in Brazil, it was prohibited to use ivermectin. Right? Ivermectin, I mean, there are studies that show that ivermectin is efficient. There are studies that show that ivermectin is efficient.
No, there isn't a single peer-reviewed study that shows the efficacy of either of those two things, and the peer-reviewed science actually demonstrates potential harm.
No, not true. Right. Well, and regarding just one thing regarding cherry picking, because I think that's very important too. Well, I think one Nobel Prize winner counts for a lot. I think it's more than a cherry. It's an big cherry, okay? And also, I always remind of 1931, when the Nazis in Germany got 100 scientists to publish a book called 100 Autoren gegen Einstein, to prove that Einstein was wrong. Right? 100 scientists to prove that Einstein was wrong. And Einstein said, okay, I don't care if there's 100. If only one proved that my theory is wrong, it would be enough, right? So maybe, maybe one cherry can prove that a whole theory is wrong, or one single cherry, like the Lancet study, can be used basically to avoid people to be saved by a certain drug.
One cherry doesn't make a cherry pie. I'm sorry.
So I want to jump in as moderator. Then we're seeing a diversity of perspectives. So look at that. How do the panelists at the end, you really focus on communication and effective solutions. Now, when you have this diversity of perspectives, where do we go?
Well, I like to think about it in terms of disturbances. I like to think about disturbances and how they affect what seem like stable systems that are in equilibrium. I think our lives are like that. And I think COVID is a good example that sort of collectively disturbed all of us around the globe due to this virus. And it has been so interesting, as someone who studies disturbances in forest ecosystems, wildfires, tree falls, hurricanes, and so forth, to see how the human population has responded to the disturbance of COVID. And in studying disturbances in forest ecosystems, I'm sorry if you think I'm a monomaniac about trees, but actually I am, because they relate to so many things in our lives.
Someone has to speak for the trees.
Someone has to speak for them. That would be me. Yes, that's right. But what we learn when we study, what we ecologists learn when we study forest dynamics is that although forests seem so stable, you know, you think of the redwood trees, 2,000 years old. The oldest bristlecone pines are 4,500 years old. And yet, in our lives, we think of as disturbances. You know, we have childhood, we go through adolescence, we go to college, and we get to be grown-ups and so forth. And our lives sort of, in the general sense, seem smooth. But in fact, every system, whether it's a forest ecosystem or a human population or a microbe or a dog, has disturbances in its life. And those are sporadic, they're unpredictable, and they have unpredictable consequences. And we tend to think of disturbances as entirely negative. Even the language we use with disturbances are catastrophic floods or devastating wildfires. But disturbances can also promote growth. They can also promote a system that changes in response to the disturbance that has occurred. And so, one of the things that I think of with COVID is that our response to that disturbance, that collective global disturbance of COVID, actually opened many of us up, including scientists, up to think about how we need to seek information from diverse sources. Sources that might be seemingly non-effective or even harmful, but turned out to be very effective with the vaccine, using a new way of developing a vaccine. That's a new, diverse way of looking for a solution. Secondly, very often, recovery from a disturbance requires the enhancement of the web of relationships that happens in that system. So a tree that's isolated in a pasture, for example, after farmers cut the forest around it, still requires the pollination and fruit dispersal mechanisms that make that tree reproduce. And finally, I think most significantly, and I think this happened with COVID, is that when we all collectively sort of recovered from COVID, when that became no longer a threat, we arrived at a third state, not the original state, the first state, not the disturbed state when we were all in our houses with our masks on, but now we here are achieving and have achieved a third state. And so where are we as scientists and as a population? We're in a group where we know to seek information from different sources, from enhancing our web of relationships, and also that we're in a new state. I don't know about you, but I use Zoom calls to talk to colleagues across the globe, to collaborate, to enhance my web of collaborators. There are other things in our lives now that we don't take for granted, just human health, that we don't have greater appreciation for the medical field and for medical workers. So we can ask ourselves questions about what did this collective disturbance do for us as humans? And as scientists, I think we can think about how did COVID and that disturbance and other disturbances that are going on, climate change, for example, or other disturbances that we can't even foresee at this time, how can we figure out to learn what we did in response to COVID so that we can better respond to a more productive, more useful, and more equitable third state in the future.
Agreed. I like this almost Hegelian dialectic of newness emerging. I like to think about, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about the need for strategy, and this builds on something you said before, Nalini, about we should be learning from marketing and advertising. I agree, with a whole heaping pile of ethics built in around what it is we are trying to help promote. And I think the scientific community, and I think this is on us, we have not been as strategic about communication as we should be. I don't think strategy is a bad word. I think it's all about the ethical underpinning of that strategy. So what would that look like? That would look like to me, and I think this is a really important part of the solution, that we develop infrastructure. You know, a lot of times I work at a university. You, Michael, you're at a university. You're at a university. We compete against each other for dollars, for grants, I think we need to look at the common good of getting on the same page about how we promote the value of science and the high quality of knowledge that it produces that enables us to live on this planet the way that we do. So I think that needs to become part of what it means to be a scientist, not just training, but that we learn who are the different audiences. There is no one general public. I hate that term. There's no general public. You see it right here on this panel. We have very differing opinions, and that's great. Bring it on. Let's have those conversations with respect and dignity. Love that about this meeting, that we can disagree so respectfully. But the science community also needs to understand who trusts whom to do what. And if there's a challenge, what do we do about that collectively? So I'd really like to see us work more and more toward a common good and a common understanding of how, I lived in Maine for 16 years, so pardon the metaphor, but how a rising tide floats all boats.
So to the panelists, you have an incredibly engaged audience. I have a stack of cards. So I'm going to try to organize themes and get to the questions that I can. But riffing off some of those last points, what's the role of education? How soon do we start learning how to communicate?
Do you want to do rapid fire, just each of us weigh in? Yeah, that'll be fun. Well, I mean, it's all about education. It's about educating the public. It's about educating the next generation. It's about providing them with the resources so that they can better educate others. But we can't wait until, the young folks grow up to tackle the problems we face right now. We have to make sure that we take the measures necessary so that we leave them a livable planet. We leave them, a sustainable world that they will inherit, and they will use their education to make things even better.
So, can I, I thought you were. So, I think the answer for education or for any other aspect is more democracy, more freedom. Freedom. I think that's the key issue. Not try to censor people, not try to censor the social networks, which is a tremendous instrument for freedom of expression, freedom of communication. Let's not depart from what is bad. Of course, there's something bad, but let's not depart from that. Let's get the flow of information going, of people thinking. Paul Feyerabend, very important philosopher of science, said that, I don't know how he arrived at that. Well, Feyerabend is a great guy. So please, anyway, can I go on?
I'm hopeful that someone just leaned against the switch. So yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
I thought they meant the bar's closed. You got to go home. Is that not what they're telling us? All right.
So just that 90% of advances in science are made by amateurs. So and not by professional scientists. Okay. I think that's. We have to think beyond official education and to think the aspect of overall access to information and to education. Thank you.
There's this concept in science communication called the knowledge deficit model. Nalini, you're familiar with it. And it's the idea that if we just add more information, we're going to fix the problem. And that's not how it works. Education is really, really important. But culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We've got to make connections, and that's so much of the work. I feel like you and I are kindred sisters in this, of trying to connect disparate communities with each other who might have different values and viewpoints across some common good. Because people will only believe you if they trust you. They will only hear you if they trust you. And I think one of the solutions has to be some common ground building, which is why I love improv so much. It's very effective for this.
Just a very quick thought. I agree with you. I don't think the problem is information deficit. It's a misinformation surplus.
Agreed completely. I agree completely. I think what I'm saying is a form of education that also builds bridges. It's not just about conveying information. So I wanted to make that really clear. I agree with you.
One of the things I didn't mention about my background is that I was in the Latin Scrabble Club when I was in high school. And so that has given me a love for knowing the roots of words. And the word education comes from ex ducere, which means to lead out from one place to another. And I think one of the things at play here is that scientists and professors and people in academia feel they have to lead their students out from one place and lead them to another, which in many cases is true. But you know, this morning I gave a talk to some students at CU Boulder at an environmental studies class, and it was wonderful. There were about maybe 40 or 50 students there, and I talked about my work, and I gave them the title of our panel this morning, and I told them I'm going to be on this panel with these amazing people, and I was wondering what you students would have to say if you were at the panel. What would you want to say? And if you have something to say, I would be happy to share it with them. So at the end of my lecture, I said, have you guys thought of anything that you want to tell the audience and the other panel members? And they said, please ask the panel members to trust us to trust them. They were asking us as scientists, as experts, to trust them that they have something to say about what they will do. Because I think they feel that we often discount them as, oh, those millennials, oh, that Gen Z, all they do is look at video games or social media. But these students were really earnest about saying, we know enough to know what to do in this world. We're getting enough information, and we're critical thinkers enough to cut through disinformation or misinformation. And so please, as grown-ups, as people who have this power to speak to others, trust us so that we can trust you. And I thought that was beautiful.
Thank you for that. We are in our final 5 minutes, so this is a good place to turn to an observation from an audience member and to build off. So the New York Times today reported that President Trump will nominate Dr. Erica Schwartz, a former Deputy Surgeon General who publicly supports vaccines. A little more mainstream, right? Right. What do you think this all means? Where is this going in terms of, in this environment? Is this turning a corner?
I believe in redemption. I really do. One of my favorite films is The Shawshank Redemption. And as I said, one of Trump's greatest successes in his first term was his support for Project Warp Speed. I would love to see him reclaim that part of his legacy. He could really make a difference.
No, I think it's interesting because this point, this information, this piece of information, it takes us to an important piece of disinformation that has been around, is that people who were, let's say, skeptical of the COVID vaccines are skeptical of vaccines or anti-vaccine. It was never the case, right? So polio vaccine or so many others, well, no, it was never the case. The case was vaccines developed in warp speed without the ability to test long-term effects, vaccines that were presented as mandatory or through different means instead of being optional. Vaccines that, for example, in Brazil, AstraZeneca was, I don't know if in the US, but was the main vaccine used for a while. And then it was retracted, not only from Brazil, but from any other country that was using it because it was causing myocarditis. Right? And people say, no, any COVID vaccine is good, any COVID vaccine is safe. At least one was not. I won't touch about the studies on the effects of the Pfizer vaccine. There are studies about that I think are honest because they go after the information. Right? So this information also is, yes, it's again like the siege on, like science under siege. Also, the information is a problem, but I think it's a problem on the other way. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I hadn't heard that piece of news until just now, so that's fantastic. And I think this is a really great example of how I think all of us are walking this sort of knife ridge between hope and despair. And it could be about climate change, it could be about the ways science is viewed in our society, it could be about education, it could be about addiction to social media. But I think we're all walking on some kind of knife ridge, and there's going to be moments of despair and decades of despair, perhaps centuries of despair, but there are also these moments and seconds and months and years of hope. And I guess this kind of discussion, I think, is what keeps us on that knife ridge so that we don't fall into despair and think, well, what can I do about this? You know, it's useless to do anything because I can't do anything, because the problems are so big. And that immobilizes us. That keeps any possible prospect of changing the situation to something positive. But if we fall too much on the side of hope, then we think, oh, somebody else is taking care of it. Our politicians are taking care of it. The Nature Conservancy is taking care of trees or anything, or nature. And so I think that also in some ways immobilizes us too, because we say somebody else is taking care of it. So I think moments like this, of hearing this very positive piece of news in a time when we are in some ways cloaked by despair, is what keeps us going, despite the negative and the other positive things that are going on.
Yeah, as I like to say, it's about urgency and agency. Urgency without agency leads us nowhere. We have to recognize that we can make a difference.
Thank you. Laura, do you have final comments? Laura? Nope. Okay, we're set. Okay, well, you know, we are at time. I want to thank the panelists first for your honesty.
Thanks.
I appreciate that and the respect, and we all learned something. We learned about how to have discussions, disagreements, and it was courage that drives that honesty. So thank you for that. To the audience, you were fantastic. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but I tried very hard to integrate your questions, and they were terrific. Thank you all.
And thank you for doing such a great job moderating this session.